Good morning. So we're going to try to get started more or less on time. So if people could get settled, please. Okay, good morning. Can you hear me okay? Don't know if I need my classroom voice or can you hear me. Okay, so good morning and welcome. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. I'm Mika Muirs. I'm the chair of the Department of Economics and also the co-director of the Program for Gender Analysis in Economics here at American University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our conference on Pathways to Gender Equality. We've had really an amazing response to our call for papers, to our invitation to come out and discuss your research and your policy ideas about gender equity and inclusion. I'm sure that many of you have been inspired by the particular moment that we're living in, both in the US and globally, by the Me Too movement, by the threats to Roe v. Wade and protections for safe and legal abortion for women in the United States, by the outlawing of gender studies in Hungary, and by the dark and coordinated gender ideology movements that are developing in Latin America and Central Asia and Africa that are seeking to roll back women's rights. So this conference has been made possible by a generous grant from the Open Society Foundation to support our work at American University in educating and mentoring a global network of feminist economists. It's also been made possible by our collaboration between the Program for Gender Analysis in Economics and the Institute for Women's Policy Research, which we launched in 2017. We wanted to use our location in Washington, D.C., and our respective groundings in the academic and policy communities to bring together scholars and policymakers and activists, that's you, to focus on creating pathways to gender equality, and also to learn how economics might change when the discipline is used to address these questions. The work we do over the next day and a half and the short and long-term collaborations that we establish here will contribute to moving society along the pathways to gender equality. We hope, too, that it will result in enduring links between American University's graduate programs in gender analysis and you, the global network of feminist scholars. So now I'd like to introduce the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Dean Peter Starr. Dean Starr is a noted scholar of French literature and culture, for which he has received the award of Chevalier des Palmes Académiques. Since coming to American University, Dean Starr has contributed importantly to increasing diversity, inclusion, and dialogue, helping to bring Dr. Ibram Kendi to American University and found the Anti-Racist Center and Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, supporting engagement of students and faculty with invited scholars like Teju Cole, who gave 2 amazing talks to packed, engaged halls this semester, and by supporting our collaboration with the Institute for Women's Policy Research and this conference. Dean Starr.
For the francophones in the room, you'll be amused to hear that once I was introduced as a Chevalier des Palmes Académiques, the Knight of the Academic Apples. Thank you, Mika, and I can't tell you how proud. Mika just mentioned really 2 reasons why we at American University are particularly committed to the ideal of social equality writ large. The Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, which has had an amazing resonance and really crosses over into all aspects of life, including economics. And of course, the collaboration with the Institute for Women's Policy Research that brings us here. I want to do a little bit of special pleading on behalf of our Department of Economics and a couple of others. Our commitment to gender diversity, among other forms of diversity, in both scholarship and staffing in such male-dominated fields as economics, mathematics, physics, and philosophy is both historic and deeply felt. And let me give you an example just from our very close to home. Our Department of Economics has long been a leader in promoting gender equality in the economics profession. Not only is this year's incoming class of PhD students 66% female. Wait, this next figure is even better. I tell you, I promise you, the next figure is even better. 38% of our full professors are women. Find me another Department of Economics in this country where 38% or more of, and we're aspiring to raise that figure, and we will because we have some really fantastic associate professors. A deep-seated commitment to the analysis of gender's role in economic life is a cornerstone of our department's pluralistic approach to the discipline of economics writ large, and its commitment to effect meaningful change in the economic policy worldwide. It's now my pleasure to introduce American University's 15th president, and not coincidentally, the first woman to serve in this role, President Sylvia Matthews Burwell. You don't get away that easily. As you surely know, President Burwell served as the 22nd Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services from 2014 and 2017. In that role, she's widely credited with saving the rollout of the Obama administration's Affordable Care Act. Prior to that, Sylvia directed the Office of Management and Budget, served as president of the Walmart Foundation, and spent 11 years at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she served both as chief operating officer and as president of the Global Development Program. President Burwell earned undergraduate degrees in government from Harvard University and in philosophy, politics, and economics from Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. Please join me in welcoming Sylvia Burwell.
Dean Starr, thank you both for those remarks, but even more for all that you do every day to support the kind of issues that we're going to be discussing today. And I want to thank you, Professor Meares, for your leadership in our economics department. And I want to thank the Institute for Women's Policy and Research for co-hosting the conference, and the Open Society Foundation for their generous support. And I want to welcome you all to American University and we are in the Washington College of Law. And as someone who spent a lot of time at the Office of Management and Budget, the National Economic Council, and the Treasury Department, I feel right at home in a room full of economists. For me, it's like coming back to a home crowd. And of course, I'm very happy to see some familiar faces as well who are joining us today, and thank you. We're pleased to be joined by Cece Conrad. When I was at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we were just starting out, and so we would often turn to MacArthur as a place to really learn from what they had been doing and what they were doing, because it was both the history and the innovation that we saw often at MacArthur. I also learned a great deal from another one of our guests. So 21 years ago, hate to admit that, when I served in the White House for President Clinton, I had the opportunity to work alongside the new chair of our Council of Economic Advisors. And we focused on many different issues, but perhaps one of the most important that we focused on was making sure that our economic policy work was grounded in the substance of what those policies would mean for American families. And I believe it was that same commitment that I saw at the White House that made such an effective chair of the Federal Reserve and the first woman to hold that position. Dr. Yellen, I am so glad that you have done many, many firsts. It's appropriate that we today and these events are actually being held at our Washington College of Law. In 1895, an aspiring attorney named Delia Sheldon Jackson asked if she could study law from Ellen Spencer Musey as her apprentice. The paths to most elite law schools at that time were closed off to women, 1895. Musey herself had been denied entry to a couple, so she and her friend, Emma Gillette, decided to clear a path themselves. So on February 1st in 1896, the first women's law class began, taught by Musey and Gillette, with 3 students, one of them being Delia Jackson, who had gone to her. It was also the first class of what would become the Washington College of Law. And the first class was modest. It didn't have the pomp and circumstance we associate with the academy today, but it was a first. It was the first school to have a woman dean, the first law school that eventually would graduate an all-female class, and it was remarkably the first law school in the world founded by women. And these are the seeds from which American University has grown, and it's appropriate, as I said, that we're here today. In our very roots, we are a university that just knows we are stronger when we open the door more widely to more people. We're stronger and we learn new perspectives and consider new and different ideas. We're closer to the truth when we produce knowledge that takes into account a wide array of experiences and backgrounds. And we're all better off when society designs policies with all that in mind. And we're not afraid here at AU to take that first step. Our program on gender analysis in economics is an example of that. It's one of the first programs in the US with a formal graduate program that emphasizes both theoretical and empirical economics training in gender analysis. It's a program that teaches the importance of gender in macroeconomics and microeconomics, a program that looks at the application of gender analysis in developing economics, labor economics, and so many other branches in the field of economics. And it's home for path-breaking research on the care economy, the economic effect of violence against women, and how we can bring our economy ever closer to actual gender equality. But perhaps most importantly, this is a program that's focused on the first that we're going to reach in the future by investing in and inspiring a new generation of economists and policymakers, people who understand intuitively how important diversity is in the field of economics, people who promote gender equality on college campuses, in nonprofits, and non-governmental organizations across the globe, and in the halls of government, people who will chart pathways of their own. In 2009, the economist Elinor Ostrom said, "We should continue to use simple models where they capture enough of the core underlying structures and incentives that they usefully predict outcomes. When the world we are trying to explain and improve, however, is not well described by a simple model, we must continue to improve our frameworks and theories so as to be able to understand complexity and not simply reject it." The goal of this conference and of our program on gender analysis in economics was an idea first echoed by the first, and so far only, woman to receive the Nobel Prize in Economics during her acceptance of that very same prize. American University is a place committed to explaining and improving the world, but we will and cannot succeed in our mission unless we are willing to constantly dive into the complexity of that world, especially the complex dynamics of gender. We must recommit ourselves each and every day to improving our frameworks and our theories. Ellen Spencer Musey had a quote as well that we like to use here at AU. It is, "The keynote of success is readiness for the opportunity." And I believe we're gathered here today because we are ready for that opportunity to reshape the debate around the role of gender analysis in the economic challenges that we face today. And I know, thanks to the wonderful program that's been planned, the great panels that we have, and the experts that are gathered here in this room today, that we will succeed. So thank you, and I hope it is a great day. Thank you.
Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce the final opening speaker, Dr. Heidi Hartman. Dr. Hartman is a MacArthur Fellow. She is the president of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and she is Distinguished Economist for Gender Analysis in Residence at American University. Dr. Hartman.
Good morning. It's so great to see you here. After about 10 months of planning, we're now all brought together to have an opportunity to learn about how to use economics in our public policy analyses and in our research. And all of you are here to learn and to show us how to do it. So thank you for coming. Not only is American University the first economics department in the United States and the world, we are told, to offer the PhD with the concentration in gender analysis, The conference is also put together by IWPR, the think tank that I began in 1987. And when I began it, I didn't know if it would last for more than 6 months, really. But now it's 31 years of experience, and we have begun a partnership, this partnership here at American University, to develop policy research projects together. So we're delighted to see all of you. We work from an intersectional perspective, and it provides policy analysis to all of the states in the United States, the nation, and increasingly around the world. I also want to thank the European Union, specifically the Jean Monnet Fund, as they have now made a second grant to IWPR to enable us to bring leaders together from the European Union with those from the United States and other countries. So thank you, Jean Monnet Fund. The Institute works with researchers, policymakers who need analysis of issues, and advocates who have their pulse on the policy process to produce studies that help move that policy forward to create a more inclusive economy, an economy with public policies that actually address women's needs as well as men's and serve all of our families. Some of the themes represented here today include employment discrimination and equal pay, how to get women into non-traditional jobs, the #1 issue that tops the charts in surveys of women in the United States. Caregiving embraces virtually all the conference sessions, which in the United States is closely related to healthcare, one of the only wealthy nations in which healthcare is still not a right, although we've made great progress. And it's also near the top of public opinion polls excuse me, as an unmet need in the United States. The lack of paid family and medical leave, the lack of subsidized child care is one reason for the intense interest in this area in the United States. But the need is truly international. Another theme of the conference is assets and entrepreneurship on the one hand, and poverty and hunger on the other, and you'll see workshops about both here. And throughout the conference, and this is the first time I've seen this, is an emphasis on organizing, especially in the roundtables. Prior to this conference, you may recall that IWPR organized 7 of these conferences on feminist policy, public policy topics, but this is the first to have so much interest in organizing, expressed not only by academic researchers, but also by the activists from the public interest groups who are here with us today. The turnout in this conference also shows the intense interest in the Me Too movement, as Mika commented on, the demand for equality for women of all backgrounds we saw in the Women's March, which wasn't just in Washington, but around the world on January 19th, 2017, I think a day that none of us will ever forget, and in the large number of women responding to this demand by running for office in the United States. So please enjoy yourself for the next day and a half, and please, after the wonderful opening plenary with the many stars we have assembled for you, organize yourselves into finding the sessions after that and for the next day and a half, because it's a complicated building on many levels. So go out there and organize. And if you are from the United States, don't forget to vote on Tuesday, November 6th. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now I would like to invite the first plenary speakers to the stage. Thank you.
And I am a managing, can you hear me now? There, yes. All right, good morning. My name is Cecilia Conrad, and I am a managing director at the MacArthur Foundation. I should say that I am here representing my own views and not those of the MacArthur Foundation. In addition to being now in the world of philanthropy, I am also an economist and a retired professor from Pomona College. And I am also a bit starstruck to be leading this panel today. This is an amazing group of people who have been assembled here, and I'll call your attention to bios that are available, I believe, online and in some of the materials. But as I ask a question to a specific speaker, I'll try and say a little bit to introduce them so that we can go directly to the discussion. But let me just note at the opening that I was trying to do a count, and I think there are at least 4, maybe 5 past presidents of the International Association for Feminist Economists up here. There's a MacArthur Fellow up here. There is a former Federal Reserve Chair up here. And there is an international superstar in economics and gendered analysis up here. So I am just delighted to open today. Our topic is on looking at diversifying economics. And the notion of diversifying here really has multiple components, and we're going to try and cover all of them in the panel today. The first has to do with representation. And as many of you are probably aware, economics is, in terms of gender representation, the poorest performing among the social sciences, and also not doing very well compared to many of what we think of as traditional STEM fields as well. A recent report on the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession, their 2017 report, has in its conclusion a really depressing statement. It says, looking at the past 20 years, there has been no progress in the representation of women at either juncture, entering the economics profession or advancing from untenured professor to tenured professor. In the past 20 years, students, and this is looking at first-year students, undergraduate students, PhD students, have hovered between 30 and 35%, assistant professors between 25% and 30%, and there has been some growth in the associate and full professor, but most of that growth comes from some increases we had in representation 30 and 40 years ago rather than over the past 20 years. If you look at underrepresented minorities, it's even more dismal. Percentage of PhDs earned by underrepresented minorities from 1995 to 2015. In economics, 3%. Compare that to anthro, 9%, history, 9%, political science, 11%, psychology, 14%, sociology, 13%. And it's also worth noting that there is a kind of spillover relationship, which brings us to the second area of diversifying, and that is, what does it mean to have a lack of representation in terms of the practice of the field, in terms of the nature of economic science? So just one little noteworthy study in the recent report of the Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Economics Profession. It's actually their 2018 report, which is already online, so I'm very impressed. They did a study of academic articles containing the word racism. Now, remember earlier the distribution I said of percentage. Economics, 1%. Yeah. Anthro, 4%. Political science, 3%. Psychology, roughly 4%. And sociology, 5%. And so it's hard not to believe that there isn't some relationship between the nature of representation in terms of the profession and the types of topics and fields that we cover. And so we want to talk a bit about both of those today. And before I pose the first question, let me just note from my own recent experience at the MacArthur Foundation, I run the MacArthur Fellows Program, sometimes called the Genius Grants. But it actually is a program that's focused on recognizing exceptionally creative individuals. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at the nature of creativity. And in this space, particularly in the business and corporate world, there's a lot of attention to how the diversity of teams, diversity in terms of backgrounds, diversity in terms of types of cognitive skills, how the diversity of teams contributes to much more creative ideas. And so one of the things that I think we'll be talking about today is whether or not economics itself could be a more creative and innovative and exciting discipline if we had greater diversity across the board, representation, and also in terms of methods and thought processes. So I want to start by asking Chairman Yellen to talk a little bit about why does this matter? These dismal numbers, why does it matter?
Well, thanks, Cecilia. I see a number of reasons why it matters. First of all, is just the basic issue of fairness. I think women and minorities are underrepresented, and it represents a kind of unfairness and inequity that needs to be changed. There's also the fact that women and men have significantly different approaches in views on public policy issues, which I think means that women's voices and those of minorities need to be heard. They need to be at the table. There's a recent survey that found that male and female economists have quite different opinions on questions like health insurance and the minimum wage. Relative to male economists, women are more supportive of government regulation. They're more concerned about inequality. They're less likely to see labor market opportunities for men and women as equal. So I think underrepresentation of women probably constrains the range of issues that are addressed and limits our ability to understand familiar issues from new and innovative perspectives. I think diversity, you mentioned this, Cecilia, it also changes group dynamics and decision-making, and the behavior of individual members changes with the mix of the group. This is evident from lab experiments. Apparently, mixed gender groups display more intense mutual monitoring and produce better outcomes in business-oriented scenarios. In dictator games, women give more than men. Diverse groups outperform in solving complex problems. Diversity promotes deliberation and disrupts conformity. And a study of academic research found that papers written by ethnically diverse research teams receive more citations and have higher impact than papers written by authors from the same ethnic group. My friend Christine Lagarde often jokes that we might not have had a financial crisis if it had been Lehman Sisters rather than Lehman Brothers, and I agree. Women work in all areas of economics, but I think they tend to be attracted to issues of great importance that have been largely ignored by men, and I'm thinking about gender issues such as the treatment of women, who are more than half the world's population, the family, humankind's most important institution, children, which at some point includes all of us, and healthcare, which concerns all of us. I think even in a subject as seemingly gender neutral as macroeconomics, women's perspectives can be extremely important. There have not been a lot of women in top macro policy positions, but those who have served, I think, have been particularly concerned about how policies affect people and their lives. And I'm thinking particularly of some colleagues of mine at Berkeley who also chaired the Council of Economic Advisors. Laura Tyson was known for speaking out very forcefully against welfare reform during the Clinton years. And Christina Romer, who is one of my heroes, absolutely insisted that the Obama stimulus plan had to be substantially greater than $500 billion to begin to address the huge impact that the financial crisis would have on jobs. At the end of the day, there was a huge impact on jobs, but she did get her way, and it would have been worse had she not. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. So Chairman Yellen touched a bit on why it matters in terms of not only the intellectual work of economics or the academic work, but also how that feeds into policy. And Lee Badgett, who's a professor of economics at University of Massachusetts, has been kind of operating at that interface. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about how you see diversifying economics making a difference. Push the button.
Green means go. Okay. Yeah, I think it's extremely important on a number of dimensions. We're mainly talking about it with respect to gender so far, but of course women, there are lots of different kinds of women with many different sorts of experiences, people from other countries, women of color, LGBTQ women, or non-binary people who also have their own unique points of view, life experience, things that are important for getting a full range of people's lives represented within our profession of economics. So I think one of the places where I've seen that the importance of that is in the context of LGBTQ issues in public policy. Having economists who may be of any sexual orientation or gender identity who've done research on gay families, for example, was extremely important in the same-sex marriage issue. It didn't really matter so much who was doing the research, but mostly it was, as far as I can tell, either straight women or LGBTQ economists. And the simple fact that queer families were taken seriously, maybe not being exactly identical to straight families, but families who were different in degree. They weren't a different species, right? So we could see that the kinds of decisions that families made were very similar, especially when families had children. They look very much alike. And that kind of perspective from economics made a huge difference in legitimizing some of these topics in public policy settings, whether it was courts, legislatures, or referenda, op-ed pieces, whatever it was. It made a huge difference. And I think that's where I see a difference that maybe kind of flows out of what Chair Yellen was talking about, the women who've been very involved in public policy making. But women feel, I think, women and all the people and all of our own diversity, we feel a responsibility to where we come from. And so I think that's what connects us to organizers, as Heidi was talking about. That's why we want to be connected. And because I think we sometimes instinctively, sometimes more formally understand that our best shot at making change is to partner with people outside of the academy to actually figure out what needs to be done to move us forward.
So I want to come back in a moment to this topic of the partnering and the activism that might be associated with this. But first, I want to take advantage of you being here, Lee, because I know you have been active in some work to try and address these numbers. I mean, we've made this argument that it matters, and yet we've seen over the past 20 years very little progress. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about what could we do to get more diversity in the profession.
Well, I think we can learn something from the business literature on diversity, which is not just that diversity itself matters, but also how we manage diversity matters a lot. And that we don't do very well in the economics profession. So partly out of the uproar over the economics job market rumors site last year, the AEA convened an ad hoc committee that eventually recommended that the AEA create a new committee which now exists on equity, diversity, and professional conduct, and I'm one of the members of the committee.
Lee, could I interrupt for just a moment? Could you say just a little bit about what the uproar was? Because I don't know, does everyone know what the uproar was?
How many people have heard of this? The economic job market rumors site is something that, there's definitely a generational difference in knowledge about this. That purports to, kind of inform people about what's going on in the job market, but in fact it was a forum for a great deal of sexist, racist, and homophobic comments about members of the profession. And by the way, it still is. The difference is that one of the first things that the AEA did was to to create its own site. This, I think it's called Spark, something like that, where conversations about the profession can take place. And they're going to collect information about the job market to try to reduce the influence of that particular site. There's not much you can do about getting rid of it, but I think we could all collectively boycott it, and that would certainly help reduce its power. But yeah, but the horrifically demoralizing things that it revealed about people in our profession were just quite stunning, and these were the mostly sort of younger, less senior members of the profession who you would think might actually have, benefited from several decades of of discussion about these issues, and the kind of the cohort change that we hope for in terms of attitudes around race and sex and sexual orientation, for instance. Anyway, so as a result of this, we have a committee. And I don't think, we haven't gotten very far in kind of thinking about management, but what's clear is there may be some barriers that we need to address. So the first thing that our committee is doing is a survey of all of the members of the AEA. So this, you will see this very soon in your mailboxes if you are a paid-up AEA member. A chance to tell the AEA what your experiences as an economist have been in graduate school, as a junior faculty member, as a senior faculty member. We want to know all of it. Secondly, we are trying to take advantage of some of the technological advances and encouraging people to report things that happen, whether they're sexual assaults or sexual harassment. You may have heard of these information escrow accounts. Apparently it comes out of a kind of a game theoretic model of the first mover disadvantage in reporting things that happen. And it's a chance to make it easier for people to report when things happen. And so as a profession, we can see, if somebody keeps moving from job to job because they're, maybe not treating their students very well, we'll be able to identify who those people are and make it easier for people to pursue different kinds of recourse. And then sort of one of the other things that we've just started talking about, which I find fascinating, is, one of the things that the different groups within the AEA have been doing is suggesting best practices on how to diversify our profession. And so our most recent committee, we had, a discussion about, what does best mean? How are these, have these been subject to evaluation? Do we really know they're the best? This is like economics. So of course we're going to worry about those sorts of things. But I think what's clear is that although the AEA has made, I think, a great step forward in convening a committee to push these things forward, there will inevitably, somewhere along the way, be some resistance. And so we have to stay on top of it. We have to be connected together, so when we need to, we can speak in one voice and say, we want these practices to become part of, search procedures. We'd like to see, I'll just pick one, not at random. We'd like to see job interviews not take place in people's hotel rooms, where you have to sit on a bed and answer questions. So, there are all sorts of things that that I think will need to stay on top of as this committee progresses, not the least of which will be the analysis of that survey data.
I want to give a moment. Is there anyone else in the panel who would like to just comment on the issue of how do we move these numbers? How do we change these numbers? And I'm impressed by some of the statistics we heard from the dean here at American University. And what is your secret sauce?
Thank you. I'm very privileged to be part of a wonderful faculty, economics faculty, that has really supported, with struggle, not very easy, but has supported strongly now the program on gender analysis in economics. And I'm also very proud to say that we have come with a wonderful partnership with IWPR that complements the strength of our faculty doing and teaching gender economics. Now, this vision of having a unique program on gender analysis within the economics department took a couple of decades. It goes way back to when Barbara Bergman, who joined us, became concerned and foresaw the need of the increase in the demand for skills for economists and researchers doing gender and exploring gender economic issues with unique tools of understanding gender. And therefore, we created this program that allowed us to bring together a group of faculty that will promote and mentor gender innovative research. Now, one thing that is very pivotal in this program, and also the kind of research we do, is that we want to promote pluralism. We are an economics department that has both heterodox economics approach and mainstream economics approach. We vision a department that coexists in different schools of thought, because there is importance in having discussion and disagreement on the same issue using a different lens. We also cherish the fact that we see economic analysis from a gendered perspective to learn from other social scientists. That multidisciplinary approach and methods is pivotal in understanding how human behavior and decisions are made. We are a social science, and yet we tend to have, at least in some mainstream economic models and other schools of thought, archaic ideas about how people make decisions. We assume individual, rational, autonomous people. And yet, every single one of us here came to be here and became successful in our work because we were cared for by somebody, and in our later years, we will need that care once more. So the idea of dependence, the idea of nurturing is very important, and yet that tends to be very neglected as part of an important economic activity. We therefore see the need to learn from other social scientists, and we make use and encourage our students to diversify in their methods, to ask questions that have not been asked before, to explore the economics of the dowry system, why it remains prevalent even if it is considered illegal, to explore the economic cause of the violence against women. These are important issues, and we as economists cannot learn solely by looking and using standard conventional economic tools and models. It's because the way this body of work it's because economics as a discipline is a social construct. It has been primarily shaped by the evolution of economic systems in Western civilization, and the influential thinkers are men, so that the models and theories that have been predominant depict the economy and the day-to-day activities from their own experience and perspective. And therefore, in our program, we make sure and we bring out in our 2 core courses on gender macro and gender micro, the explicit and implicit biases, the male bias assumptions, the exclusion, I'm going to use that word now, of a wide range of economic activities, such as non-market and unpaid work. The way we depict the economy purely and solely for the market, the exclusion and experiences and interests of needs of certain groups. Now, this has fundamental impact. It is not just an issue of body of knowledge, because economics is highly influential in policymaking. And therefore, the solutions, the development strategies, the economic policies that come out from that framework, from that set of conventional tools that tend to be exclusionary and have both implicit as well as explicit bias, can represent only and support only the interests of certain groups, often at the expense of those excluded. We know that the notion of exclusion resonates now more than ever. The sad thing about these biases in economics is that many economists are not even aware that they are biased. They believe they are objective. They use precise tools, mathematics, quantitative analysis, statistics. Biases provide a narrow range of comfort zone and level in reasoning, in critical thinking. And so bias helps us do intellectual processes with very little effort. It stifles, therefore, creativity. For creativity requires following an idea beyond stylized facts and the familiar. Instead, one, if you have biases, and we do all have that, begins to develop stereotypes, positive and negative. She's a woman, and therefore, he's black, and therefore, oh, he's an immigrant, and therefore, he's Middle Eastern, and therefore, does that sound familiar? This is particularly dangerous for the economics profession, as it is very influential in policymaking. And therefore, what we do when we have models and theories that are bias evaluation or a particular interpretation of data or analysis and results reflect implicit judgment based on fulfillment or lack of fulfillment of those stereotypes. I am pleased, I'm going to wrap up my talk about diversity here and our program, that the work of IWPR has exposed those biases in US domestic policies and policy-making processes. The work of the IAFE, International Association for Feminist Economics, and its members, can you raise your hand, those of you who are members of IAFE here, expose the male biases in economic profession in rigorous and scientific way. The training that our own program provides to its students is to scrutinize assumptions and theories to see if there are any gender bias. So that's my answer to your question.
So what we've heard so far is that there is really kind of a two-directional, bidirectional relationship between representation and the practice of the field, in that the underrepresentation of women may contribute to a lack of certain questions being asked, but a lack of the way certain questions are asked may also contribute to the underrepresentation. And then you add on that sort of the social and behavioral context of the profession itself, and that may be the beginnings of a story here. Now, Professor Floro, who many of you know is a professor here at American University, also highlighted something that was different about this program from really the rest of the profession, and that is this notion of pluralism. Michelle Lamont, who's a sociologist, did this study. It's a book called How Professors Think. And it was an ethnographic study sitting in interdisciplinary grant-making communities. And one of the things that she learned in sitting in those communities is that economists tend to do very well in competitions for interdisciplinary grants. And her observation as to why, I'm going to paraphrase here, economists display an especially high degree of epistemological cohesiveness. They tend to define quality in the very same way and come up with consistent ranking of proposals. So they come as this kind of unified front. The second piece of evidence about the rest of the profession on this, the rest of the economics profession, comes from a paper that many of you have probably seen because it went viral before it even appeared published, called The Superiority of Economics. And here they looked at citations to flagship journals from different disciplines. So political science cites top economics journals at 4%, and top sociology journals at 1%. The American Sociological Review cites top economics journals at 2.3% and top political science journals at 2%. None of these numbers are really high, so it says a lot about social sciences, but let's go to economics. Economics cites political science journals at 0.8% and sociology journals at 3%. And in another piece of evidence from the same study, they ask about how much you think interdisciplinary study is relevant, and economics ranks dead last. So what this says is that we're not used to pluralism in economics or using different methods and different approaches. And one of the people I want to turn to next is someone who has been consistently pushing us both to think about the range of topics and the methods that we use. And pushing us, when I say pushing us, not only economics, but also particularly those of us who think of ourselves as feminist economics. So I want to turn to Beena Agrawal, who's a professor of developmental economics and the environment at the University of Manchester, the Diane Middlebrook and Carl Desiraji visiting professor at the University. Gerasi.
He invented the reproductive pill.
Visiting professor at the University of Cambridge. A list of awards that I won't even begin to quote to you, but really one of the leaders internationally in this space, to talk a bit about the question of diversifying methods. How do we get more methods being used in topics?
Thank you. Cece, your two comments. Yeah, okay, thank you. By the way, that the person is Carl Gerasi, who was one of the inventors of the reproductive pill. So, both Janet and Lee talked about the importance of gender perspectives in macroeconomics, the way we look at families, and so on, and the need to diversify. So I'll take a slightly different tack, and one of the things I'm struck by is that there are entire areas which are really fast growing in mainstream economics, which are rather little touched upon by feminist economists. One area is environment and ecological economics. Another is institutional economics. And of course, wealth inequality is now, many people are, over the last decade, feminist economists are looking at, but again, it's rather limitedly examined, not as much as it needs to. So, for instance, if you take environment and ecology in our daily lives, we recycle, we talk about it all the time, we talk about polluted air and so on. We also know that women are much more affected by, say, cooking fuel, bad cooking fuel, mortality rates, morbidity rates. Yet feminist economists are not talking about this. There are also there's a vast body of new journals, Environment and Management, for instance, Environmental Economics and Management, which I think ranks among the top 20 within the economics profession. And so, in 2010, I did this book called Gender and Green Governance, asking the question, well, if the gender composition of community forestry groups changes, what difference does it make? And I'll come to what difference it might make. But in 2016, a group of scholars did a global search of 11,000 articles looking at this topic for forestry and fisheries. And they found 17 had covered it from any discipline. Only 13 had empirical analysis. Only two economists, myself and one other. So for graduate students who are listening, here's a vast area to be working on. But why does it matter? So I'll just share two bits of results from Gender and Green Governance. I discovered that there's a vast body of work, not by economists, but some by economists, talking about women's exclusion from governance in environmental management. So I turned the question on its head and said, what if women were included? Would it really make a difference? The sort of question we're asking for corporations. And what did I find? Firstly, that critical mass matters. We all talk about 1/3. I tried to measure it, and indeed it was 25 to 33%. If you had that proportion of women, these are poor communities across India and Nepal that I studied, and if you had that proportion of women, it makes a hugely significant difference to conservation outcomes. So people are listening. They want to know if women are included in the group, what difference does it make to the normal mainstream objectives, which is conservation? So I do think that this area, it's a puzzle to me, but let me come back to the puzzle. The second mainstream topic is really wealth inequality. Now we know, I know as a development economist, that discussion on issues of wealth and income inequality go back a long way, at least to the 70s, but if you remember, there's a huge literature talking about the trade-offs between growth and inequality. It's something that still continues. growth with inequality, growth and inequality. And then you had people like Tony Atkinson, who actually wrote in his book on Britain was, I think, Wealth Inequality in Britain was 1978. And I'm sure, and Piketty's, of course, bestseller, Capital in the 21st Century. None of these, of course, these books, these papers, talk about gender inequality. So in 1994, when I wrote, I wrote this Field of One's Own, I found that there was very, very, very little work. There was no data, so I couldn't enter the topic as an economist. And law is very important, so I studied, I taught myself inheritance laws for 5 countries, which varies by region, by religion, by type of property. Then I asked the question, well, why is there a gap between law and practice? And I had to read huge amounts of anthropology, something that Maria Floro was talking about, to understand social norms. So the issue of interdisciplinarity was extremely important. Today, we do know that there's work, there's a growing but too small a body of work. There's Carmen Diana Deer's work on Latin America, there's work by Cheryl Doss, Agnes Quisumbing, and so on. And yet, if you look at the huge body of work on women's employment, gender wage gaps, and so on, and the minute amount of work on gender inequality and wealth, there's a huge contrast. So I'd like to pose this question, really. Why is there a neglect of such large topics by feminist economists, or insufficient attention, if you like? And I'm sure many of you may have answers, but there are 3 possible explanations that I want to pose. One is there some conceptual gap in the way we think about some of these topics? So for instance, from Engels onwards, there was the idea that women's class was defined by the family into which they were born or the family into which they married. So if you have a rich daddy, you're obviously going to be rich. If you have a rich husband, you're going to be well off. And women's class, we know, and then this began to unravel when we began to look inside the household and the inequalities within the household. This is enormous amount of work that feminist economists and others, feminists in other disciplines have done. Now, once you begin to unravel, you begin to see how important it is that women have assets and wealth of their own. But could it be that we somehow still think largely when we think of women's economic status in terms of employment and not in terms of wealth? And yet, if you say who's a well-off man, we'll reel off figures from the richest men across the continents. So this could be one possibility. Should we rethink how we conceptualize the questions we ask and the topics we think about? The second is, of course, lack of data. Now, I think all economists, and including many of us feminist economists, look for data to empirically verify things. And if there isn't data, we compromise. And I think this is happening across graduate schools as well, that if you have the data, you write those 3 essays, where is the data? And we focus our questions on available data. Why don't we go and collect our own? So when I asked this question on gender and green governance, there was no data. So I collected it from India and Nepal. So I really think that if you want to ask unusual questions and new questions, don't be limited by the data. There have to be mechanisms by which you might want to collect your own. And the third, and I'll end with this set of comments by this, is the challenge of interdisciplinarity. Now, we talk about interdisciplinarity, but what does it mean? Often if we apply for grants, we have a team. Let's have an economist, an anthropologist. If you want to do agriculture and hydrology, let's have an engineer, and so on and so forth. Is this enough? And I want to put this challenge because you cannot have conversations across disciplines unless you try and yourself bridge them a little bit. I know it's possible because the example I gave about law. Now, teaching yourself law from scratch, never having been to law school, and inheritance law across 5 countries was no easy task. But I taught myself enough law to be invited by the NYU School of Law to teach law, which I did 1 semester. I'm not suggesting I know everything about law. I certainly haven't stood up in court to defend a case. But somewhere it is a challenge that we ourselves, if we want to do interdisciplinary work, need to read more of other disciplines. Oh, that's anthropology. Why should we look at that? Oh, that's something else. We'll be okay if we talk to engineers and look at hydrology. It's just something, there's a bias that science, the science side of interdisciplinarity is okay, the humanities part is not. But of course that's not true, because for gender, the humanities part is absolutely key. I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you.
So one of the areas where I think feminist economics has opened up new topics is in the area of care work. And there are a couple of people on the panel here who've been particularly engaged in that, including Nancy Fulbray, who's sitting next to me, MacArthur Fellow and retired professor from the University of Massachusetts. And I'm interested to hear about, and in the care work is a space where I think the activism and the economic research kind of have started to find each other. And I'd like to invite Nancy to talk a little bit about some of that work, and more broadly about, because care work also brings us into questions about different identities. You know, I talked with some statistics about underrepresented minorities at the beginning. You'll notice that I did underrepresented minorities and women, and even though I'm a Black woman, and there are a few others of us in the room, there are so few of us that I can't pull out numbers. At one point, I used to be able to name us, but that's just one of the categories. And so I'd love for you to kind of talk about that work a bit.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I think there is a recurrent theme here about the very complicated and kind of fascinating dialectic between the diversity of people and the diversity of ideas. And I just want to retrace kind of one little historical episode that I think is maybe illustrates that before talking more about the issues of economic theory and care. You know, about 26 years ago, when we started the International Association for Feminist Economics, it came out of a dissatisfaction with what was going on in the economics profession, including the efforts of the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession, also known as CSWEP, because we felt that CSWEP was very focused on individual opportunity and individual career choices, and not enough on ideas about gender and care and feminist theory and so forth and so on. And I think the journal Feminist Economics has created a very rich and successful venue for that more substantive theoretical discussion to emerge. But it's also very clear that the issues that CSWEP raised about individual representation and has continued to pursue are also very, very important. And so I just wanted to mention that I think that organization has made an important contribution. They've consistently collected the data that we rely on to analyze the representation of women as undergraduate majors and as faculty members. And this is actually kind of an onerous task. And also more recently, CSWEP, and in particular, a group headed by Claudia Golden, has sponsored a series of literal field experiments at universities that are designed to actually test methods for improving the representation of undergraduates in economics. And you can find online a pretty interesting paper by Catherine Porter and Danila Serra on an experiment at SMU, Southern Methodist University, where they actually do a randomized trial. Honestly, it's not my idea of field research is not, I'm not always totally taken by randomized experiments. In this case, randomized exposure to a charismatic female economist. And testing the size of the coefficient, on that. I think there are a few unmeasured variables in the equation. But it's still, I think, a really interesting sign, and it tells you something about this dialectic between diversity of people and diversity of ideas that I think is really, really crucial. I do think that the sort of empowerment of women in the economics profession, maybe not reflected totally in numbers, but I think in kind of intellectual and political traction, has really changed the way that we think about economic theory. And I think there are three big ideas and this is kind of overlapping with Bina's comments about, about thinking about theory, points that kind of emerge from the lived experience of most women who typically spend a good portion of their life taking care of other people, whether children or friends who are sick or disabled or elderly parents. And I think the three big theoretical issues that emerge are first, a real awareness of public goods, things that are not bought and sold by individuals, things that can't be purchased in the market, transactions that are really important that reach into the future and that are simply not captured by markets. What we're doing to our global environment for future generations, that's not something that they can weigh in on or exercise their individual choice about. And I think in many ways, the degradation of our social and economic environment is a very, very distinct parallel with environmental crisis, that there are many things that our current social and economic institutions do that have effects on our environment that spill over in ways that don't allow us to effectively exercise much individual choice. And then also really highlight the need for us to cooperate more effectively, to overcome our differences and think about our common interests and act effectively on those. That's a process that requires a really serious consideration of differences based on collective identity and interests and the ways in which we are really profoundly divided, especially when it comes to a short-term agenda, and especially when we feel that we're under political attack or experiencing economic stress. And I think economics has really failed as a discipline to really alert us to the importance of complex forms of collective identity and action that we really need to understand in order to build coalitions that are required to cooperate together more effectively in the political arena. And of all of the efforts to try to figure this out more effectively from a feminist standpoint, I think the literature on intersectionality is really profound and really important because it invites us to think about the parallels between inequalities based on gender and race and class and citizenship, and to develop a conceptual vocabulary about fairness, justice, exploitation, and also efficiency that is can be applied to a kind of critical analysis of all forms of illegitimate inequality based on membership in socially given groups. And I think this is a really important task that can be furthered by attention to care work. I see the care agenda as a unifying agenda for the reasons that many people have given, that we all go through the process of being dependents as children and often return to a form of dependency as older adults. We share a common interest in the production and development and enhancement of human capabilities as really important economic resources. A lot of our political differences, debates over the welfare state, have to do with the ways in which we allocate public resources to health, to education, and to social services. And I think really the task of feminist political economy today is to embrace its own theoretical and demographic diversity and develop it further in ways that could build a stronger political coalition around these issues.
So I want to return to Chairman Yellen and note that when you were, I think right after you became chair of the Federal Reserve, you did something that I think was historic in that the Federal Reserve co-hosted a national summit on diversity. And first of all, I just want to thank you for that. It was just so incredibly inspiring to have a premier institution of economic policy kind of take that stand. And in your opening remarks, you said some interesting things about diversity in economics that were kind of hopeful. You said that I'm quoting you here, in trying to raise awareness of diversity in the economics profession, I'm aided by the fact that economists are well acquainted with the concept of diversity from their work. You note that when conducting a survey, economists understand that the results will be more meaningful when the diversity of the sample approaches the diversity of the population being studied. And in finance, we know that diversity is fundamentally important in spreading risk, and so on. And in your comment, you quoted Christine Lagarde in terms of if it had been Lehman Sisters instead of Lehman Brothers. And I wonder if I could turn to you now to talk about, to address from your perspective, some of the places where greater diversity in methods and in topics would be important to economics, some of the gaps that you've identified.
Well, I mean, I do think it's very important to have greater diversity in methods and topics. I see over time economics is becoming a harder and harder science that values more and more mathematical modeling and looking only at evidence that's systematic and can provide a rigorous test of predictions of theories. And I think what's happening that really concerns me in economics is that topics that are truly important are being ignored because they can't be well approached using standard methodologies. And it also creates a bias against new ideas. The points that you made about looking at anthropological studies, of sociological studies. I think what's happened in economics is that anything that could be called anecdotal or case study type of methods are simply ruled out. They can't be published in the major journals. And to my mind, this is a serious methodological bias that is blinding the profession to very important phenomena that you've discussed in the panel. I mean, from my own world of macroeconomics, I mean, let me just give you an example of the kind of thing that concerns me. I mean, one of the huge failures of economics, I think, is that economists failed to predict the financial crisis. They really didn't see what was going on. There were pieces of what happened that were seen by people in particular subfields, but to really see what was going to happen in the crisis, it would have been necessary to put these pieces together into a consistent pattern and maybe to do some speculation. I'm only aware of one economist who even tried to do that. That's Raghu Rajan. No one else would have done it, and it goes to the rewards in the profession, that there are huge rewards to publish in the top journals, particularly the top 5 journals. Anything that involves crossing subfield boundaries, putting together bits of information, it doesn't result in a publishable paper. I mean, let me give you what I consider a huge indictment of the methods of the profession. AIG had $533 billion of commitments to insure securities such as credit default swaps. And that was tremendously important in the dynamics of the financial crisis. Suppose an economist had uncovered that. That would have been sufficient to see that there was a crisis coming. I don't believe that would have been a publishable paper. And the incentive would not have been to pursue that and to make anything of it at all. And to my mind, that is a kind of an indictment of the profession. So, I mean, as I think about what we need to do to diversify methods and the profession, I mean, I don't know quite where this goes, but publications and the standards for publications and also promotions seem to me to be important things to consider.
That I think is a really very important point in terms of thinking about what the reward structure looks like and the ways in which certain types of work may not get rewarded. In fact, that's a stunning example. And I'm going to turn to Lee for a moment because I know that she sort of makes this case of public scholarship. And I wonder if you talk about the reward structure a little bit and how you've encountered it.
Yeah, let's think about public scholarship for a second. So what would that mean? That would mean maybe choosing research topics that answer important public questions that might not be something that will obviously get you a placement in a top journal. It might mean taking findings of research that you've done or that other people have done, which gets you even farther away from the kind of individual-centric reward structure that we have. There's no question that it's something that's not valued by the profession, and yet it has been valued increasingly by universities. So I don't know of any universities that do a great job of rewarding people for doing public scholarship, but I can tell you that as an, what do they call it in psychology, maybe something like self-rewards can be very high. And I think that intrinsic value that we can get out of doing that kind of work is something that can be huge. And maybe that's the best we'll ever have, but I would argue that it ought to be enough. And it kind of ties back to, again, feeling some responsibility for moving forward some of the people who are like us in the places that we come from, and thinking about how we do that. And I think we miss a lot of opportunities. And so I'll just say kind of the three things. I wrote a book called The Public Professor, How to Use Your Research to Change the World. And there are people in this room who have done that. And I'll just particularly call out Heidi Hartman, who it was the first time when I was a young scholar when I ever worked for, a think tank here in DC, and it was incredibly important to learn from her about, what you need to do to cross that bridge, and a bunch of other people too who are here who I've learned from. But so first of all, I think you have to see the big picture. What's the issue that you're working on? Where does research actually matter in that context? Can you identify, important questions that you can answer, not just with your own research, but the research from your own field, kind of like what we do when we teach a class. We don't just teach classes on our own research, we pulled it all together. And then if you can identify where those questions are being asked, then the second step is to develop a network that will get you into those places so that you can help provide some of the answers that people need to those questions. And the advantage is that if you have a wide enough network and get your ideas and your findings into the hands of people who are making decisions, they will be going into places that we will, frankly, never have access to: corporate boardrooms, votes in a legislature, decisions made by judges, decisions made by corporations. I mean, we can influence those decisions, but only if we're kind of connecting to those people. And then the last thing is, and this is totally not rewarded, which is doing a good job at communicating. I think, people get impressed if you place an op-ed in the New York Times or the Washington Post, but it's probably not going to count very highly towards tenure, but it can matter a lot in this larger sense. So I think we have to reclaim the value of doing this work really from both a personal perspective and from our own ability to see how it might actually contribute to change in the world. So if our profession is not rewarding that, that's a problem. We need to change that. And it's hard to know exactly how to do that, because I also wouldn't necessarily want to see it go into like a accounting game and trying to weigh how much is the New York Times worth compared to the Houston Chronicle, which is like the next step in all of this stuff. But I think if we could change the culture of our profession, that would matter a lot less, I think. So I would like to see our profession kind of go back, in many ways, back to its roots, to say, this is why we do this. We want the world to be a better place, and we can help do that as economists.
So I've been trying to make some lists as I've listened about some of the themes, and I want to kind of use this moment to summarize them a bit before I ask a final set of questions and then give an opportunity for a few questions from the floor. And so I think there's some themes that have run across this in terms of our discussion of diversifying economics. We talked earlier about representation and issues of culture, which have been a thread throughout. We have talked a bit about topics and methods, and let me see if I can capture some of those. The first is a place where feminist economics has contributed a toehold, and that is in thinking about activities that are not captured by markets. And we have perhaps failed to take that as far as we can, I think, as Bina has pointed out, in thinking about other contexts where activities fail to be captured by markets. We have begun the conversation about the role of collective identity in economics and how that plays into economic models. And we can think about collectivities in multiple kinds of categorical ways, as Nancy has pointed out. We have focused in on issues about methods, the heavy emphasis we put on particular kinds of data. We've heard this in the context of the IIG example. I want to come back to the randomized control trial examples to get some thoughts on that as well. And we've talked a bit about our insularity and the ways in which we don't necessarily embrace or even think it's necessary to engage with other disciplines and methods from other disciplines. And so I want to pause for a moment to see if there's people on the panel who think I've left something key out. Oh, reward structures, which I think is an important part of the cultures. Is there anything else you would like to add to that list? Well, I'm going to pick on Sergi for just a moment because we talked about the sort of things that are not captured in markets. And I know in some of your macro work, you've tried to tackle that topic. And could you say just a little more there?
First of all, I've been working on the issue of unpaid work for nearly 28 years now. In fact, I remember Nancy Fulbright sort of encouraging me to explore this issue further. At the time when there was little data nor recognition in the economics profession about non-market work, well, outside of the household production models or household economic household models. And so I thought that in order for, and yet it's so vital that policymakers recognize this for a simple reason. Alongside the ecological crisis that we are now facing is a growing crisis of care. And we don't even know that it's happening because families are struggling and dealing with it on a private level. Much of it is done by women, especially in vulnerable and low-income households. They do it day after day without question. Okay? They always have to struggle with the things of having to have work-life balance, long working days, doing multiple tasks, multitasking, and so forth. So it is therefore important, in my view, to bring this issue of care to the forefront of policymakers. But it is a big task. I cannot do it because I don't have all the skills necessary to do such a work. I don't have the resources to do it either. But at one point, in the last couple of years, there was an opportunity for me to bring together a fantastic group of scholars from all over the world. 40 of them from different disciplines: macroeconomists, feminist economists, labor economists, demographers, time use researchers, and sociologists. Its aim is to produce research that incorporates the care economy and gendered behavior into the policy toolkits that policymakers often use. And that's the macroeconomic model that provides the framework and foundation and serves as sort of the guide for, through policy simulations of finding out what would be the likely impact of a particular policy option. Missing in that picture is the care economy, including paid care work done oftentimes by domestic workers, people who are earning very low income, often without any kind of benefits. At the same time, unpaid family members, majority of whom are women. And therefore, we put this project together ultimately to support policy, macroeconomic policy, social policy, labor policies that promote public investment in care provisioning services and the development of comprehensive national care strategic plan. It's very important to make this care visible to policymakers, and it will enhance their work. It will expand their ideas, talk about creativity and innovation. It should not just happen in research, in academia. It has to happen in the realm of policymaking. And that is just a challenge. But what's interesting about this project, and let me pick on some of the points that Cici kindly succinctly put together, is the fact that it requires multidisciplinary approach. It requires having microeconomists like me working with macroeconomists who look at the big picture, the aggregate economy. It involves people in particular schools of thought listening and presenting and getting feedback from other researchers, from other schools of thought. It also brings, in my view, a very interesting point. Can we make macroeconomic models and theories grounded in reality? Big task. However, let me share a couple of interesting points that was observed in our project. When our macroeconomists started working on models, they asked questions. So, what's the effect of fertility on women's labor force participation? Is there an impact of women's, sort of care work on their wage earnings? Well, how do households arrange paid care and unpaid care? When do women or parents bring their children to daycare school, and when do they take over? What's the linkage between unpaid and paid care? What will happen in 2030 now that we have an aging population and have demographic shifts? And this is not happening only in countries like South Korea, which is we're using as a case study, which has the longest life expectancy in the world and has one of the lowest fertility rate, to the point the natural growth of the population is about to decline. So we're talking here of major and grave social consequences, and our policymakers are not even paying attention to that point. So we brought together a team from Seoul National University to conduct in-depth interviews, talking to people. This is an important method, by observation and talking to people. As the late Barbara Bergman said, you have to go out of your offices, out of that computer, and listen. And so that's what we did, is we brought together macroeconomists learning from people who are in the field, collecting information, time use survey data to understand better what really is the connection of the care economy and its impact on female labor supply, on productivity, on economic growth. If the government sees, well, if we provide child care, that is a huge cost and it is a sunk cost. No, it's not. We have to show the benefits to society. We have to show the impact that it is. After all, the maintenance of the labor force and their development, and hence the functioning of the economy, and ultimately the survival of this society, rests on adequate quality care provisioning for children, for the frail elderly, for the disabled and the sick. So I just want to share that news about this project, which I'm all excited about, and I have here in this audience some members of, and including in this table, some members of that community of scholars. Thanks, Sissy, for that. Thanks.
All right. I have two last questions, but I may not get to both of them, so we'll get to the first one. And that is that, Nancy, you made a reference to experiments that are underway that Claudia Golden is leading about how do you change the makeup, the representational makeup. And it's an interesting, I think, place for us to think for a moment. When I first described to a colleague in philanthropy that I was coming to this conference and the topic, his first question to me, because it's the vogue in philanthropy right now, is how are you going to show impact? And the impact issue is an interesting one because we've talked here about how can we diversify the numbers, but we've also talked about, we've made a case that diversifying the numbers will change the science. And so one of the questions I'd like to pose to the panel to get your thoughts on is how would we go about documenting the impact of having greater diversity of thought, having greater diversity in representation on the science? How can we persuade economists who are admittedly data-driven and averse to anecdotes? What are the ways in which we might begin to approach this? It strikes me that there is a research opportunity here for somebody in this room.
Honestly, I think the first thing we should do is push back against the notion that you can always quantify or measure results. And I think there's a growing literature in economics actually pointing out how you can really mess things up by making decisions purely based on what you can measure. I mean, Bengt Holmström won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago for a highly mathematical explanation of an entirely commonsensical proposition, which is that if you reward people for aspects of their performance that can be measured, they will devote less effort to aspects of their performance that can't be measured. And this is actually a pretty key to understanding why care itself is under-rewarded, whether it's unpaid or paid. It's very hard to measure the individual value added of care work because care work involves teamwork, because it involves collaboration with the person who's receiving the care, because it's tailored to individuals, it's not fungible, it's not exchangeable, it's often very dependent on the personal interaction and characteristics of people. And so, not surprisingly, very few care workers get performance pay, whereas a lot of people in the financial sector get performance pay. So in a way, this whole thing about performance, this is the effing problem. If you'll forgive me, that's what I meant by effing. Yes. So,
Forgiving.
So, no, that said, I do think we do what we can. And it is our comparative advantage to try to measure things. And I think I'm totally support what Sergi is saying about measuring unpaid care work, measuring it in hours, measuring it in terms of what the replacement cost would be, measuring it in terms of what the opportunity cost would be. I think measuring social and health outcomes is also really important, and that we can do that. But so yeah, let's use our collective wit and wisdom to try to arrive at that, but let's also really insist on, the fact that some things really can't be measured, or they can't be measured very well, and that it requires a broader and more interdisciplinary approach to their assessment.
Bina, you talked about collecting data. Would you like to comment on this?
Comment on a couple of things. Firstly, on measurement. So, I'll give you an example of how small nuggets can actually help you question large assumptions. So when I was a doctoral student a long time ago, I found that agricultural economists were aggregating labor use by converting female labor hours as equivalent to half or 3/4 of male labor hours. So you ask them why? They said, well, women are paid 3/4 or half of men are paid. So labor market discrimination was converted into academic assumptions and figures. Nobody questioned it. I was very, very, very uneasy. So how do I take this to my doctoral dissertation to change that assumption? So I, as Sergi said, go to the field. I went back to the field. I was using a pre-existing data set, but I would be talking to farmers. And this agricultural engineer, young man, came to me and said, Madam, I did this little experiment, and here are the results. And he gave me a cyclostyle sheet in which he tested potato digging equipment with women and men in terms of how many potatoes they would dig in an hour, or how many rows they would go through in a given period of time. Women were 3 times as productive as the men. And this is an engineering experiment. So I use that in my thesis to say, at least we are going to convert female labor as equivalent to male labor. It was the most discussed point in my Viva Voce. So you could, sometimes some of these nuggets can be used to challenge assumptions. I'll give you another example of methods I use. Now, there are a lot of anthropologists here who might object to the idea that what they do, what you get is anecdotal evidence. Of course, that's not the case. So when in a field of one's own, on ethnographic evidence, I looked at hundreds of ethnographies. And what I was looking for, is there a link between where women get married, post-marital residence, and the likelihood of parents being open to giving them land? Because you can't actually carry land if you're married at distances. And I found in these ethnographies that sometimes they would tell you exactly how many marriages took place at what distance, in which villages, how many miles even. So I pulled together, ethnography by ethnography, a data pool, which I used to create maps across South Asia on post-marital residence. So I'm just saying that there is information in really unusual places. We do need data. We don't need, we're not going to convince anybody, but the location of the data and the way we actually pull it together can also prove key to convincing people. The second point, if I may, Cici, is really about the issue of impact. So I'll share one is that at least in British universities, under the research excellence framework, impact has become really important. So, of course, yes, quite right. How do you prove impact? We've already talked about that. It's extremely difficult.
Bina, could I ask you just to say a little bit about the research excellence framework? Because I'm not sure everybody knows what that is.
Well, it is every 4 years, people, all the universities, whichever departments, it's the basis on which state money government money is allocated to universities, one of the bases, and faculties are supposed to submit their best papers. So the last exercise, each faculty who would be in the ref would submit 4 papers, and they are starred 4-star, 3-star, etc. And then there's an independent set of a committee which then goes through this by different disciplines and allocates rankings, just in a word, if you like. So impact is, but how do you prove impact? is extremely important. Citations are not enough. That's the easiest thing to do, is really, has it made an impact and changed people's lives on the ground? Has a policymaker cited you? Well, policymakers don't cite anybody. I mean, I've been, if I look at the Indian planning, in 9th 5-year plan, we have these 5-year plans. And I've written chunks. If I took notes that I gave them, they've cut and pasted them in entire chapters, slightly making my English bad. But I can recognize them. But they will not say notes received from Beena Agarwal. However, the couple of ways in which, as I think as social scientists, as feminist economists, as people wanting change, we do want impact. So apart from writing in journals, the same research, as you said, could be written in newspapers. I frequently write 800-word, 1,000-word articles. Now, if you write a memo to a government official or a minister, they will put it aside. If they sit down in the morning, Sunday morning, and they open the paper, they can't really get away from it if your piece is there. The third is that we tend to forget that policy is made not just by government, but also policy is implemented and often made by civil society. I mean, that's a really huge area, small groups, big groups. So I proactively write things which civil society can use, and I hold workshops for them so that they can take those ideas forward. Sometimes those workshops have huge impact. So I did one workshop in 1990, in the 1990s, late 1990s, on gender and land rights, and they formed a group. 17 NGOs came. They formed a group which is sustaining today. This was late 1990s, and they've trained government officials. They've lobbied. They've done plays. So sometimes the seed falls on really fertile ground. And finally, I would say seize the moment, because occasionally in your life comes a chance that you can really use your knowledge. Now, in my life, this came in 2005, when the Indian government was wanting to amend the Hindu Succession Act. 80% of Indians are Hindus. And this is the inheritance law, which had major gender inequalities. And I wrote a couple of pieces. No civil society person was taking it up. And so come February 2005, I said, let me jump in at the deep end and see what I can do. So I helped catalyze a campaign for the amendment of the Hindu Succession Act. It involved deposing before a bipartisan parliamentary committee on law and justice. In 9 months, August 29th, 2005, the parliament passed the act which made inheritance for 80% of Indian women completely gender equal. A different point in time, a different parliament, may not have worked. If I had gone to sleep and said, no, I have to write an academic paper, it may not have worked. But so sometimes, and I just feel it as a gift that came, and one could seize the moment. I'm sure Nancy and others, all of us on this panel, and many of you would have had those opportunities, and I'm sure you made a big difference. But that's what I would say. May I just add one more thing on the positive side, on methods and so on, which is that students across, certainly in the UK, are rebelling against the overemphasis on irrelevant topics and heavy modeling. And so the Manchester University, the students started a group called Post-Crash Economics. And they organized sessions alongside the Royal Economic Society meetings, parallel to them, and they called people who they thought were doing more relevant economics to speak. So Ha-Jung Chang, for instance, I was one of the speakers, and many others. And this has spread across the UK. So for instance, Cambridge, where I'm currently based, they have a Cambridge Society for Pluralism in Economics. It goes by different names, but I think it's a spreading movement. Of course, in the US, you have new thinking, new economics as well. What? Yes, Institute for New Economic Thinking. So perhaps there is hope there as well. Thank you.
All right, we have time for some questions. And I believe because it's live stream, you should come to the microphone to ask questions. So if we, I think one of the things you've seen here is something that goes back to the opening as we talked about the importance of representation, and that is that it matters who's in the room as to what kinds of questions get asked. And those examples that we just heard are real illustrations of, if you didn't have that person in the room, we could have probably continued to see the calculation happening in the 3/4 versus 1, and so on. All right, so I'm going to start over here, and we'll then go to the other side.
Okay. Hi, this is wonderful. I'm Felicia Kornblue from the University of Vermont, trained as a historian and an interdisciplinary gender studies scholar. And just building on what was just said, especially I think for Professor Floro and Chair Yellen, I'm curious about why there wasn't more of a shift in the US profession after the crash. It seemed like there was a little bubble moment of people saying, oh, Keynesianism, kind of a good idea, it turns out. Oh, look, our overly mathematical models not really working, et cetera. But then it seemed like it just dissipated so fast, and like there was such a strong pushback. So I wonder how you sort of experience that, and also how you understand it.
Well, let me just start off quickly. I think that the economics profession has been humbled by the fact that there was no prediction of the financial crisis and a failure to understand what was happening. And well, it may not be a revolution. I do think efficient markets theory, the prevailing view before the crisis that we can count on financial institutions to watch out for themselves, to understand what they're doing and maximize their own profit. I think those views have really been downplayed in the years since the crisis. Behavioral finance has become a more important field. There is much more thinking about systemic risk. Now, the methods are those, I think, that can get published in journals of mathematical modeling and systematic evidence, but I do think some of the simplistic assumptions that markets work and lead to the best outcomes for everyone, much more thinking about bubbles. So I do see some hopeful change, and I don't think that's moved back totally yet.
I do agree that there has been some sort of nudge in the economics profession, given that we had the Great Recession and the financial crisis. But it was just a nudge, in my view, because economics profession has not become diverse, in my point of view. There are deeply seated, and we are all trained economists, but we are trained in a particular way of thinking, the way we explore an issue, and that has to change in order to make for that event like the Great Recession or the global financial crisis to really have a strong resonance and shake us in terms of how we think about how the world works, how the economy works. Now, and this, and go back to the issue of biases, which so many of us are even unaware of, our own prejudices and thoughts and actions. They have become habits, and we do them unconsciously. Oh, yes, there is a crisis, there is a bubble, and yes, we will do this. But the only way we can break these habits is to allow our profession to be diverse. For breaking those habits require more than just good intention.
Yana?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Yana Rogers from Rutgers University in New Jersey, and thank you to the awesome panel speakers. I think our profession is all the much stronger because of each and every one of you. My question starts out with a shout out to Sandy Darity, who's making some news for his idea on baby bonds. It's been picked up by a senator from New Jersey, Cory Booker, who may be running for president. So I'm really inspired by how a paper that apparently was presented at the AEA with you and Derek Hamilton is being picked up now in the media. So my question for any or all of the panel speakers is if you could take one idea or policy recommendation of your own and have it be picked up by our next presidential hopeful running against Trump, what would it be?
Yana, I think that's a great question, but I'm not going to answer it. I think we need actually a coherent agenda for the care economy that is not based on baby bonds or guaranteed employment or UBI or health insurance. It has to, I think really what is really needed to change the political conversation is kind of a unified care agenda for the Democratic Party in the US. And I think it will be hard. It will be hard to create an agenda like that precisely because of the diversity and the divisions that we're dealing with. But that whatever we could do to create that more coherent, I guess what I'm saying is, I think we need to focus more on synergies between health insurance and higher education and early childhood education and baby bonds, and less on individual selling points.
Well, I do a lot of work on discrimination against LGBT people, and there still is no federal law that says that's illegal. There is an interpretation by the EEOC that it's sex discrimination, which is illegal, but that is an issue that's sitting in front of the Supreme Court right now. I think we can kind of all guess where that might go if it actually gets taken up by them. Yeah, but I feel like we still have some unfinished business in terms of at least clarifying there are certain kinds of things that we think are wrong to do in the workplace, and we will continue to have policies that act as sticks to the employers who don't see the benefit of diversity. So that's one that I would kind of continue to push.
Climate change. Encouraging cooperation and collective action. And looking into the business of government to coordinate various segments of society to behave in a fashion that will support an agenda that will address climate change.
We are going to have elections before you do next year. I would say jobs, assets, and care support for women in India. I'm not talking about what the US should do, but I think I would pitch for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Sarah Gamage, International Centre for Research on Women. And I'm really intrigued in our discussion about what shapes our rather hegemonic field. We've focused very much on academia, on publishing, but I think actually donors have a tremendous responsibility. And in a world where we're all chasing money to fund our research, I sort of live in the ecosystem of the NGOs, and we all survive on soft money. I think it's really challenging for us to do mixed methods research in a world where there really is a heavy weighting towards the gold standard of the RCTs, data mining, machine learning. And so that a lot of the things, a lot of the inquiries that we want to do, it is increasingly very, very hard for us to get funded. And I'd love to hear a little bit about the impact of that from your perspective on shaping the field. Thanks.
All right, well, as the person who's from the donor side, I'll say that this is a real conversation that's happening in the field of philanthropy. I think there is a little bit of pushback to some of the emphasis on RCTs. I'll just speak from a personal perspective. I was a founding director of what's now called the Mentor Program in Economics. It was called the Pipeline Project. And there was a real push to set up a kind of randomized control trial of the intervention, kind of like what the experiment that's going on. But we had a situation where the goal was to increase the number of Black and Latino and Native Americans who were getting PhD in economics. And we're talking very, very small numbers. And so the proposal was that I was going to have people apply and then randomly assign people not to be mentored. It just doesn't work. First of all, it creates its own flashback because you know that you're not getting mentored and the other person is. So is that really a test of anything? And so it's just an example, and I think there's more and more pushback happening in the philanthropic field. So you'll find some division across donors in this space. I think the bigger challenge for donors, and here I'll just share in my own perspective, that project that I was doing was funded by the MacArthur Foundation. This was before I got there. Karen Groen, who many of you know, was a program officer who helped to lead this. And the thought was that they would really begin to make a dent in the field of economics. And I'll have to say that after about, and they also funded research networks, you were part of those. After about 10 years of this, they concluded that they weren't going to make a dent in the field of economics a bit. And so there is a kind of circularity there, but I do think that the donors are starting to think more broadly about different forms of evidence.
Can I say something about that too? Because being a co-founder of a think tank, we worked very hard to try to convince a lot of donors also to fund what we did. And one of the things that I have seen donors do, which I think is a good thing, is to say, you know, what difference is your research going to make? It doesn't necessarily have to have, you know, a kind of a statistically significant impact on some outcome measure, but just to at least know that you are connected with people in the civil society world who can actually use it, that it's a meaningful question in that kind of context, I think is a reasonable and good thing to ask of us, to be connected. And going way beyond like the, you know, broader impacts of an NSF proposal or something like that, but something pretty concrete that we can show that there is some connection.
I think the conversation is beginning to shift. You know, we've had some major critiques. Angus Deaton, who got the Nobel Prize in Economics last year, had written a major critique at least 7-8 years ago of RCTs. There have been other economists, mainstream economists, who've been critiquing it enough for the original RCT originators to put up a defense and agree that it doesn't cover a lot of things like institutions and so on. So one of the things that funders could do would actually put together and read that material. You know, there's now at least, I would say 20 articles, or if not more, to influence, to bring that influence in, and why RCTs are very delimiting. And it becomes a basket of, within one methodology within a basket, rather than all of it. But I have one grouch with funders, if I may say, in terms, which is the insistence. I find this in development economics research, that you give funding where there is for countries, researching countries where there are problems, and not where the problems have been solved. Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, I'm currently working on the idea of group farming in Asia and Europe. And France is one of the countries which has a very old experience of group farming. And it was impossible, really, to find anybody to fund work on France. They said, "You want money to go to France?" As if I should be paying for it. And yet those examples are very important learning examples. After all, Elinor Ostrom's work. Elinor Ostrom did inductive theory building, and she looked at examples globally in order to extract the kinds of principles which would enable you to govern the commons more efficiently. And she didn't, it wasn't just limited to X or Y. So to CC and to other people who worked with donor agencies and in significant positions, I would say, let's broaden and make it more pluralistic in terms of the examples that we bring to bear. Thank you.
Thank you, and it is, I think, at our time. I'm looking to see if there are people in charge of time. Do I? Huh? I probably do. Okay. Yes, I think we will have to bring this to an end. What I'd like to do is let's just Could each person say their question quickly, and we'll know what those are, and then maybe there can be some opportunity for further conversation afterwards. But that way, that may also come up in some of the other sessions. So I'll go here first and then come back over here.
All right, hi, my name is Amy Burnett Cross, and I'm a first-year PhD student here at American University, and I came from the federal government, so I'm here to gain skills so I can be a relevant analyst in the policy space, so this has been a great conversation to listen to this morning, and I guess my question for you is, in the scope of the next 10 years, what are the skills that I should be developing right now so I can be relevant, not in today's conversation, but in the conversation that's happening in 10 years?
Thank you.
Very good
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Hi, I'm Kelly Jones from American University and the Institute for Women's Policy Research. And I was really appreciative of the comments by both Chairman Yellen and Professor Badgett on what gets published in economics and what gets rewarded within the profession. And I know we've seen more and more rigorous evidence that both of those processes are biased against women and other underrepresented groups in economics. And also that the publishing biases, affect our body of knowledge, especially in terms of preference for statistically significant effects, et cetera, as well as the types of topics, as you were mentioning. So my question for you is, as the next generation of economists come in and are working to create change within the profession, what is your advice for us in terms of this uphill battle, in terms of changing, the publishing dynamics within the profession?
Hi, Ashaki Benta, an activist. I'm just wondering what the panel feels and everybody, and I'm sorry if I missed any comments on this, but can we really expect to achieve any kind of gender equality without a complete social transformation of the economy here and around the world? I don't see capitalism actually going in that direction, being able to fulfill that. And so we need more high-level thinking and in-depth analysis moving in the direction of socialism or some form going in that direction that can really address these questions. I'm wondering what people's thinking is about that. Now we need fresh, new 21st century thinking on this.
Thanks. Hi, Giulia Porino, Sapienza, University of Rome. I have two questions, if I may, actually. The first one is talking about the financial crisis. It's been mentioned many times in the panel. What you think about the relation between financial crisis and the long tail of financial crisis, the austerity measures that followed, and the wave of populism that we see now from both sides of the oceans. And of course, from this perspective, the gender perspective, it is often forgotten in this debate. And the second question is about the civil society and academic partnership that again has been mentioned several times. Concretely, how do you see coming in terms of strengthening this partnership, knowing that the dynamics, the publishing dynamics that have been mentioned as well, but also the dynamics, the civil society organization that works more in the political, let's say, debate, institutional debate, has in terms of timeline, in terms of also impact measure, again. So how you see it coming from a concrete point of view to make this relation not only more concrete, but more structured in a systematic way? Thank you.
Thank you for those terrific questions, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to find people and continue to discuss them over the course of this incredible conference that's been organized. So please join me in thanking this inspiring panel.
Thank you so much, panelists and audience. I just want to make, before you all leap up and run out. So we've kind of eaten into our break. I want to let you know that the catering people have made all the breakfast disappear. So there's just coffee that you can grab on the way to your session. The lunches are out, but there will be a lunch. Not that you can't have lunch now if you want, but there will be a lunch break after the first session. So I want to encourage everyone to go quickly to your sessions so we can stay on schedule because we have so much exciting work to do today. Thank you.
Thank you, Cece. Very well done.
Okay. Kiss you. Okay. Look, I know you're right. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing this. Yes, yes, yes. Yes. Wonderful.
We enjoyed your comments very much and agree with your perspective on things. Yes, very much so. It's a real pleasure. Nice to see you too.
Thank you. I will do. I'll be very. Okay, marvelous. Thank you. And my card. Well, let me just write down my email, if I may.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I'm delighted. Yeah. This is a nice name. I have a very simple email, dina.india@gmail.com, and I have a website, www.dinaagarwal.com.
You want to say hi? And how do you
All right. Thank you. Hi.
I made now this generation group.
I'm going to come down here.
And they start one on how the World Bank can support aging countries.
Oh, great.
In
so glad you're working on this.
Yeah, I'm because I'm in evaluation, and then I follow topics that span larger than gender and inclusion, but like this one on aging is very much on gender. So I'm really interested in bringing a more, especially what you said is so important. Having a more strategic approach that is holistic and not just thinking measures. In the bank, what is done, for example, pension reform is not really an aging strategy, just focusing on pension reform or a care reform. So we want to bring in this much more comprehensive approach. If you have time at some point
we can talk.
let's see.
Also working on this in Bulgaria. It's very dismal indeed.
Yeah, Eastern Europe is Eastern Europe is, but but also they can speak. So they took them almost 7 years to go where France and 135. But some countries in Asia are going to be progress. There was something now about the sphere economy, the gender aspect of all this, how the labor market ties in terms of like women participation.
I don't really have any specific advice for you, except that you kind of have to step up and stride forth boldly into the world, and have some confidence in your cohort. I guess I feel like we were all kind of moaning and groaning about lack of